Hello, welcome to the Commons collaborative project Espreso.Global and Ukrainian media. I'm Olena Solodovnikova, and it's great pleasure for me to welcome David Satter, an American journalist and writer. Hello, David.
Hi, glad to be with you.
The same. David, many experts expected Putin to win the major military victory in Ukraine, to succeed in elections, but that didn't happen. Why? Or was it different version sold to the Russians? In general, how do military victories in Ukraine now affect Putin's power?
Well, the why is a question that it can be answered by the Ukrainian General Staff and the Ukrainian military. They carefully prepared. They realized that aggression was coming, or at least that aggression was possible, and they prepared for that possibility. Whereas the Russians, and I believe Putin as well, did not understand the degree to which corruption had weakened the Russian military, and the degree to which the organization of the Russian military was inappropriate for the kind of war that they were going to have to fight. So for those reasons, Ukraine, in the first months of the war, achieved remarkable victories. And in a sense, they facing a much larger and more numerous opponent, they continue to demonstrate their skill, because the fight is uneven. I think it's the task of the West now to try to make that fight more even by providing Ukraine with the armaments that it needs. But there's no denying the skill of the Ukrainian armed forces and the achievement of holding back Russia, even to the degree of that they have.
Yes, but do you think now ordinary Russians, they think that they are winning the war with Ukraine? What about their propaganda?
It's hard to say what they think, and what they think can change. This is a population that is really under the influence of mass propaganda and, of course, their own national chauvinism. The very common view in Russia that, well, maybe the war was a mistake, but now that we're in it, we have to win. In fact, that was the attitude of a lot of people during the Chechen wars. They can't bear the idea that Russia can be defeated by a smaller country, and yet they see that that's what's beginning to happen, or what appeared to be happening. Right now, I think it's very dangerous to make predictions. It probably was unwise to assume that a Ukrainian victory was inevitable after the first victories around Kharkov and Dnipro. But the fact is that the most important factor in this war, what people are thinking in the Russian armed forces, what the average soldier is thinking, what is going on in the depths of Russian society, these are things that we'll only know when a crisis takes place and the true attitude is manifested. Nobody could have predicted, for example, that Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, would successfully march his soldiers in 24 hours, 450 miles, almost to within a striking distance of Moscow, and that people along the way would indicate their support. So that's an indication that below the surface there may be processes taking place that we're unaware of, but will make themselves felt in the months and years to come, depending on how long this war goes on.
But what do you think about the Russian militias units? Can they successfully change anything on the battlefield or in the thinking of Russians who are expertised war, as is it happening now on Belgorod and some other places? I mean, voluntary units which belong to the Ukrainian army officially, RDK and Siberian units.
Oh, you mean the Russians who are fighting on the side of Ukraine?
Yep.
And how effective are they likely to be?
Yep.
Is that the question?
Yep.
Well, one doesn't know. I mean, they're small groups at the present time. Whether they would make a difference or not, I've heard various reports about them, but in fact I don't think they will be decisive. What will be decisive is the performance of the organized Ukrainian military, which has fought very well, has had Western training, needs modern arms, which I hope the West will provide, and certainly does not lack for the one thing that the Russians don't have in need, which is fighting spirit and dedication.
Yes, but you talk about Prigozhin rebel. Do you think was it fake rebel? And can someone suddenly repeat Prigozhin's actions and actually attack Moscow?
I think it's difficult now because Prigozhin had his own private army, which was subordinate to him and which believed in him, and that's one of the reasons why he was eliminated. But there could be, we don't know what's going on in the ranks of the general staff in Moscow. We don't know how loyal Putin's commanders are. We don't know if there isn't a group that feels that Russia has suffered enough in this war and that the war is being fought not for Russia, but for Putin. And therefore, it's important to remove Putin. We just don't know. We don't have any insight into that. I mean, no one on the Allied side during the Second World War knew in advance about the attempt to kill Hitler in 1944. They learned about it after the fact. And so we need to continue to resist aggression on the basis of a feeling that anything can happen, and that and if fortune will rule in favor of Ukraine, it will be because Ukraine gave fortune a certain amount of help.
Yeah, but if could we imagine that this offensive against Moscow will be successful, what we need after that? I mean, seizing power for the short term is not an option for a long term.
You think you're saying that that Russia could be successful in a major offensive?
No. I mean vice versa. Vice versa. If somebody like a black swan will be successful in offensive to Moscow, and after that they need seizing power in Russia, how they should do?
If there's a successful Ukrainian attack on Russia,
Ukrainian attack or Russian units
or Ukrainian allied Russians, what it's the realm of speculation. We just don't know. We just don't know what would happen and how loyal are people to the Putin regime. Well, we know that there are a certain percentage of the population are fully supportive of Putin because they have an imperialist mentality.
Yep.
There are others who are not so supportive, but believe that Russia has no choice but to continue, because losing the war would be a disaster. And then there are other people who either have no opinion or are opposed, but we don't know the balance. And the balance is important, and particularly when we talk about the armed services, the armed forces, or the KGB or the FSB. But this is something that the Ukrainian armed forces, that Ukraine is not really able to influence. I think the attitude should be that we hope that resistance will break, but we can't control it, and the important thing is to win back territory.
Yeah, but talking about the psychology of Russians at all, what do you think, what exactly has changed in the behavior of Russians in the 10 years since you were kicked off from Russia? Have they become more bloodthirsty? It seems that the poor Russians... Oh, sorry, yes, sorry.
I think they became more insecure. I think that as a result of the Maidan revolt, they remember that we had on the streets of Kyiv 200, 300,000 people in Maidan, on the Kreshchatyk, and I think that this made the Russian leaders very nervous, very uncertain about their own hold on power. And these aggressive actions were undertaken because this was a way of rallying the population around these corrupt crooks who run the place.
But what about that connection that Russians became more poor, and after that they have more blood people from all other planet?
That the Russians have become poorer, and as a result that they are envious of other people. Is that the idea?
Yes, the idea that before that was popular phrase that Russians vote because of their refrigerator. They wanna don't think about anything about the food, and about that something they have a little bit money. But now they became poor, but another way to have Russians in power, to give them idea about the deaths
Yes,
of people on planet.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, the point is that, but this has always been the way it is in Russia. People were poor, they understood they were poor, but they said, well, we're part of a great state. And most of all, we are able to make people afraid of us. We are able to dominate others. We are ready for war. And those cowards in the West are not ready for war. Yes, indeed, the mentality of Russia is such that there's a huge temptation to resort to war to boost the popularity of a regime. Because under those circumstances, the reaction of the population will be very positive, not just to the improvement in living standards, but to the war that's generating them. And that's what we're seeing now. I mean, the soldiers are being very well paid. Their families receive death benefits on their behalf that are, by Russian standards, very generous. So it's a situation, of course, in which there are no winners, and certainly not the Russian people themselves. But it continues.
Yes, unfortunately, and I want to make step back and ask you about the chances Putin in which conditions Putin will be finally thrown out from the club of presidents. After all, he has created more than one numbers of cheating, making his zero term, and this election seems like a parody. If Putin is considered illegitimate, will this boost Russia complete isolation and increase its aggression?
I don't think it'll have much importance because there's already a warrant out for his arrest from the International Criminal Court.
Yeah.
They don't need it. They don't need, and in fact, the whole idea of calling Putin a usurper is flawed in my view, because usually people refer to these elections that we've just had, but the reality is that that Putin has been a usurper from the very first day. There never was a day, not a single day, in which the Putin regime was legitimate. He came to power through an act of terror against his own people. And this is the apartment bombings, which I talk about in my book, one of my books. And so under those circumstances, no, I don't think that we're going to see much of an effect from this calling Putin a usurper. We should go back and say that he came to power through an act of terrorism, and he's conducted himself accordingly ever since.
Yes, exactly. But why I wanted to ask you about the legitimation, because some weeks ago, Russian Duma suddenly decided to pass the law that Crimea had been illegally given to Ukraine. But previously, when they have annexed Crimea, they didn't talk about that. Why they start this dialogue to need the help?
This is everything with them is post facto. Everything is post facto. The fact, in 2002, at a press conference with Leonid Kravchuk, Putin said that, was asked, what is your attitude about Ukraine joining NATO? And he said, Ukraine's an independent country. It can do whatever it wants. In 1994, Russia promised in the Budapest agreements to protect the territory and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and they started violating it immediately afterward. So no, it's not a problem to go and speak to other countries that are facing this kind of pressure, and reminding them that Putin rewrites history every day in accordance with what it is he considers to be in his interest. The other important thing is that the words that are written in the treaties don't have any meaning. They don't make any sense, because the Russian idea of truth is very distorted. The truth in Russia is whatever serves the regime. It's not truth per se. So, I mean, why would anyone want to put faith in a treaty signed with such people?
Yes, and about that, Russia has always been ruled by the KGB. Of course, you know it in yourself experience,
Yeah,
and
of course.
when you lived in Moscow. And in past, they used their spies to work with Western politician leaders to lower their vigilance, to make some friendship with them, to preventing that the Russian is democratic country. And finally, the world has begun to suspect that something been wrong with that. But what about that technique now, about the Russian sleeper cells now? How they are acting?
I mean, how they see themselves?
How they are acting in the West? In this,
well, in the West, they are becoming very belligerent. Of course, they are trying to. Well, it's twofold. They're trying to propagandize the West to say Russia is a Christian country, Russia persecutes gays or prosecutes gays. Ukraine is allying itself with the LGBT group. They try to convince those Americans who are ready to listen that this country, which has invaded its sovereign neighbor, which has launched a whole series of aggressive wars, and in which human life has no value, is actually a highly Christian country for propaganda purposes. And they've been repeating that, for some time. But at the same time, they've escalated the threats against the West, including the threats to use nuclear weapons. So, they are working hard to achieve their objects through intimidation and threats, or through somehow suborning the Western leaders who are not directly involved with politics, but nonetheless have interests, have influence.
Yes, and what is your opinion about why did Putin asserted that he had agreed to exchange Navalny? What signal did Navalny death give to the West?
I mean, the signal is the same signal that the murder of Alexander Litvinenko gave, that the murder of Anna Politkovskaya gave, that the murder of Boris Nemtsov gave, that Putin will just murder anyone who tries to challenge his power. But of course, they create all kinds of cover stories, and people in the West who don't want to face the reality, they can use the cover story.
But
They can and use it as an excuse for doing nothing.
But in this case, Putin played very cunning game. They say, "Oh, I was very open for the West. I wanted to exchange Navalny, but after that, sorry, he was dead."
No, they wanted. Yeah, I mean, this is a lie, probably. I mean, his offer to exchange Navalny for a criminal assassin who carried out an attack on a former Russian citizen in Berlin, it just indicates that this is a criminal regime that kidnaps people from the West and exchanges them for their own criminals. But even if such talks were taking place, it would be quite a disgrace, actually, to have exchanged Navalny for just another a Russian murderer or an assassin. It's a very unequal trade. And Navalny is a Russian citizen who should be protected by his own government, not by the governments of countries abroad. But I don't believe that they were seriously planning to exchange him. I think that's a cover story. I think that they had decided they were going to murder him, and they did.
Yes, and to talk about more global questions, in 2 months, Putin will meet with China leader. And what should we expect from this talk? After all, there are those who believe that Russia has long been a vassal of China because it has leased land to them on a long-term basis. But in another version, there are those who see China and Russia as unequal players. What is your opinion about?
Well, we don't. I mean, a lot will depend on what the West is willing to do. I mean, the big source of strength of Russia is their ability to sell their oil and gas, and if we can put an end to that, we can put an end to the war. But that requires economic sacrifice. As long as Russia is able to sell its gas and oil to China or to India, it will have the money it needs to keep up the war. So, how can we prevent that? Well, we can impose secondary sanctions. We can impose sanctions on the countries that are not cooperating with the sanctions regime, and on the contrary, subverting it by trading with Russians.
Yes, but why Putin wanna talk with Xi Jinping, with China's leader now?
Well, we don't know what's going to come up in the discussions in Beijing, but I suppose that Putin is anxious for more Chinese military and technical support.
Mm-hmm. Do you think he will use it for Ukrainian war or in the war in the territory of the EU? Because how likely is it attack to the Baltic states? Because now we talk about this option and when and how it could take place.
How likely is it? Well, we can say that under Yeltsin in the early 90s, so that's 30 years ago, they were already complaining about the treatment of Russian speakers in the Baltic republics. And they issued a national security doctrine which said that Russia is obliged to defend Russian speakers wherever they are in the world. The mentioning of supposed discrimination against Russians in the Baltic republics was deliberate, and it reflected an attempt to create a basis for future aggression, an excuse for attacking in the future.
So the problem is not in only the Putin's regime, and before, every time the Russian leaders thinking about something with annexation.
Well, I think the immediate goal is to subjugate Ukraine. And if they fail in that goal, they will not threaten NATO. If they succeed in subjugating Ukraine, then there is a danger that the next step will be to try to create a crisis over, Russian speakers somewhere in NATO, perhaps in the Baltic republics, and even if we create a situation in which even if they don't attack, they have free rein to create enormously high levels of tension with their behavior, even if there is no attack, no direct attack.
Yeah, and what can we expect from Lukashenko in this situation? Does he remain an independent figure, or he is
For the
some
moment,
kind
because
of...
he cooperates with the Russians, and for the moment they tolerate him. But I don't think that if there's no independent Ukraine, I'm assuming there will not be an independent Belarus.
Yes, absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. And our people who from Belarus who inside the Polka-Linovskого, do you know that probably?
Yeah.
Who take part in Ukrainian war on our side, they every time talk about that we started with free of all Ukraine, and after that will be the free Belarus. At the end, I wanted to ask you about that intrusive thesis that the West is afraid of Russian collapse into independent states because it doesn't know what might be happen after that. But what could be happen after Russia will be collapsed? What could be the scenario?
Well, I mean, it might mean that a more pro-Western leader would emerge. When you say Russia, we're not talking about Russia collapsing. We're talking about the Putin regime collapsing, because those are two different things. If the Putin regime collapses under the pressure of the war and Russia is there, whoever becomes to power may choose to pursue a pro-Western policy. Because after all, I mean, any person with normal common sense will understand that Russia cannot really progress economically if it doesn't have trade ties and technical assistance from the West. So that's one thing. I think that on the other hand, there could be chaos. There could be an ultra-nationalist dictatorship. There's some parts of what is now the Russian, it's called the Russian Federation, although it's not a federation if you don't elect the local governors. But anyway, in some cases, people there are fanatical, and they will they will support an ongoing war, or they will support a war against their own people, a kind of civil war. And they're capable of launching it. I mean, we have to understand what's happened sociologically in Russia. Thousands and thousands of criminals have been handed guns and told that they're heroes and had their punishment, their jail terms canceled. Now, those that survived come back and they commit crimes, intimidating everybody. And they've had a lot of experience of seeing people turned into corpses.
Yes, and so is it true that West is afraid of Russia collapse? So that's why.
Is it true that that the West is afraid of a Russian collapse? Well, I don't think that that's the number one fear right now. The number one fear is that Russia is massing troops, and Russia and Ukraine might not be able to withstand them. We don't know. I mean, if Russia collapses, basically, it's going to be a problem that we'll deal with when it arises. But we shouldn't make our policy in order to prevent a Russian collapse. We should make a policy to engineer the Putin regime's defeat. I think that's what we need to do.
But if I'm not mistaken, in your books, you talk about that Yeltsin regime will not so democratic because he started the war in Ichkeria, Chechnya, and other else. So do you really believe that Russia could change with another leader?
That's an interesting question, because we've seen how Russia changed, how the Soviet Union changed, for example, after Stalin died and Khrushchev began reforms. If they want to avoid becoming a satellite of China, they're going to have to make changes. And those changes could only be made by a leader who comes after Putin. Putin himself will not make those changes. So I think that nothing can be ruled out. Let's face it, Russia today is far different from what it was in the days of the Soviet Union. It is a country now in which there is a middle class, in which there are people who are educated, in which they do have information and access to information if they want that, information. And I think that if those people gain a critical weight in the overall political situation, then anything is possible. They could put an end to the war. They could try to reestablish ties with the West. But could they come to power? Could such relatively moderate, enlightened people come to power? It's very hard to say, because the people who are in power now do not fit that description.
To be honest, you version that Russia, in all odds, might be the vassal of China, be under their power, is more likely. I think so.
Yeah, of course. I mean, China and Russia are not natural partners, because China has a claim on huge sections of Russian territory. And a claim that's, by the way, more persuasive than the claim of the Russians to dominate Ukraine.